Yeah, so this is a biography of James Baker, who was the White House Chief of Staff for Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Treasury, and then Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War. And we spent about 7 years on the book.
Not on purpose.
Not on purpose. It was the first book anybody's written on his whole life, and it's we turned out to be a much more interesting story than we even knew going into it. And part of the book is also about Washington and how much Washington has changed, especially in the context of not even just the last 4 years of Donald Trump, but even before that. And I think that Washington is the other big character in the book, and we really thought that it told us something larger about our politics and about our country and where we are today.
When you decided to write this book, what did you know about James Baker that made him unusual and worthy of this, especially at a time when it is so divisive?
Well, it's a good question. Peter and I remembered these events, but we had not covered them really. Right? Baker was sort of this key figure from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, and I think we immediately recognized in his story, really, because he cuts across politics and policy, and that's something that Peter and I have both done as journalists, and it's not that normal. People here in Washington tend to specialize to a certain extent, right? They do either campaigns and elections, national politics, or they do foreign policy. And because we had been lucky enough to be foreign correspondents for the Washington Post in Moscow, just a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think in particular we were, thought it would be really a unique opportunity to go back and look at these events that led to the end of the Cold War. And the project really sort of grew from there. But also, it's just an accident that no one had ended up doing a big biography yet of Jim Baker. He is really a very significant figure. Tom Donilon, when we ran into him, he was Barack Obama's former national security advisor. He pointed out that he thought Baker was the most important unelected official since the beginning of the Cold War era. And a couple projects on Baker had fallen through. So it was just sort of an accident in a way. Baker did 2 of his own memoirs, but that no one had done a book on him. It just seemed like a real opportunity to tell a story both about his own remarkable life, but also about, how the world changed. That was one of those hinge points of history moments, really, those years from 1989 to 1992 in particular.
Thank you. Here, Linda Lawrence says, it's in my Amazon basket. So looking forward to this conversation. And everyone, please do get a copy of the book if you can. And you can also tag your friends right now. Please hit share or retweet or tag your friends, and they can watch live or later when they get an opportunity. Carla Baranakis, former national copy chief of the New York Times, says the book is fascinating. It's a great antidote for people who are so done with the current political situation. Thank you. And thank you, Carla, for helping us bring Susan and Peter onto our show this morning. Can you give us a kind of quick sketch of his story? Because there will be a lot of folks here who don't remember or were too young at his peak to kind of understand, as you said, perhaps the most important unelected American official in the entire Cold War era.
Right. Well, in a lot of ways, as soon as he straddled policy and politics, he ran 5 presidential campaigns, really starting in Gerald Ford in 1976. He was the delegate hunter at the convention. Gerald Ford was the last president, or anybody actually, to face a contested convention. Ronald Reagan was challenging him for the nomination. Baker helped beat him back, and then runs his campaign in the fall. And then from there on, he goes on to run George Bush's campaign in 1980, then Reagan's in 1984, George Bush again in 88 and 92. He also serves as White House Chief of Staff for Reagan, a man he had run 2 campaigns against, which I think tells you something. And he's considered by many people to be the gold standard of White House Chiefs of Staff, that he sort of showed the best way to run a White House in a crazy, wild, often partisan Washington. And of course, Secretary of Treasury, he did a lot of things there, including rewriting the entire tax code from top to bottom, negotiating big currency agreement among different states, and then Secretary of State at the end of the Cold War, which by itself would be a book in and of itself, right? Helps reunify Germany, helps bring the Cold War to a peaceful end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, organizes the coalition that fights the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, expels Iraq from Kuwait, and organizes the Madrid Peace Conference, the first time that Israel ever sat down with all of its neighbors. Then, of course, even after leaving office, after the 1992 campaign, when Bush loses to Clinton, Baker comes back in 2000 to help his good friend George Bush's son, George W. Bush, get through the Florida recount, which seems even more relevant today. We can talk about that later if you like. And he's just sort of like a figure who also represents a Washington that worked at times. Not always. It was obviously very partisan back then too. But that when the election was over, Baker believed in sitting down with the other side and saying, how can we do things and get things done? Whether fixing Social Security, whether rewriting the tax code, whether ending the war over the Contras in Nicaragua, whether it be with the Soviets to do arms deals, whether it be with the Germans to bring them back together. Baker was a deal maker. He was the real art of the deal. And I think that his story is such that it tells us about how much has changed in Washington.
Thank you. For those of us who are Hamilton fans, we know they have to decide who's going to be Treasury Secretary and who's going to be Secretary of State. What is the history of people who've been both?
Yeah, I can't wait till they make a musical after this.
There's not a lot of history of people who've been both.
No, I mean George Shultz was.
Well, and he was the other for Peter, right? Schultz.
Schultz had run the Labor Department.
That's right.
He had been OMB director, and he was Secretary of Treasury and State.
Right, and so Baker was an acting Commerce Secretary, as he points out. When his very first assignment in Washington, interestingly enough, he didn't come to Washington, by the way, until he was 45. So among many other things, this book is actually also a story about the greatest, most successful mid-career switch probably ever. He comes to Washington at the age of 45 in the Ford administration, because really, think about it, a whole generation of Republicans is sort of wiped out because of this Watergate scandal. And within 1 year, he's risen from being number 2 at the Commerce Department to running the President of the United States campaign for election. Now, he briefly was the acting Commerce Secretary in that period because his boss was elevated initially to run Ford's campaign. So he did that, he did Treasury, and he did State.
Well, thank you, folks. We're talking to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. Susan is a staff writer for The New Yorker, as well as a CNN Global Affairs analyst. And Peter is chief White House correspondent for The New York Times.